Elizabeth stood at the edge of the small clearing, her hands trembling as she clutched the wooden axe. The early morning frost clung to the ground, and the cold seeped through her worn boots, biting at her toes. She paused for a moment, staring out into the vast wilderness that stretched endlessly before her. The forest loomed ahead, dark, dense, and full of unknown dangers, but it also held the promise of firewood, the only thing keeping her family warm during these harsh winter months. Her breath came in shallow puffs visible in the icy air as she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Behind her, inside the tiny cabin, 6-year-old Samuel was trying to comfort his younger sister Mary, who had woken up crying again. Their thin blankets offered little protection against the freezing temperatures, and hunger gnawed at their small bodies. Elizabeth could hear their faint voices through the cracked door, and it broke her heart. Just a few months ago, life had been so different. John, her husband, had been alive then, a strong, kind man who worked tirelessly to provide for his family. He had shielded them from hardship, filling their days with laughter and warmth. But now he was gone, taken too soon by an accident no one could have predicted. His absence left a gaping hole in their lives, one that seemed impossible to fill. The grief was still raw, a constant ache in Elizabeth's chest. Yet what made everything worse was the betrayal by John's family. They had always disapproved of her, whispering behind closed doors about how she wasn't good enough for their son. When John died, they wasted no time showing their true colors. Within days, they descended upon the cabin like vultures, stripping it of anything valuable. Tools, furniture, even food. They took it all, leaving Elizabeth and her children with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Worst of all, they told her plainly that she didn't belong there anymore. "You're not one of us," John's eldest brother sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Take your brats and leave." Those words echoed in Elizabeth's mind, every day haunting her like a ghost. How could they be so cruel? Didn't they care about Samuel and Mary? Didn't they realize that without help, the three of them wouldn't survive the winter? Elizabeth had hoped someone, anyone, would show some compassion, but instead she found herself utterly alone, abandoned by the very people who should have supported her. It was a bitter pill to swallow, one that left her feeling hollow and desperate. Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against her, Elizabeth refused to give up. She couldn't. For the sake of her children, she had to keep going, no matter how hard it got. Every morning she rose before dawn, determined to find ways to keep them alive. Some days she ventured into the woods to gather firewood or search for edible plants. Other days she mended their tattered clothes or tried to coax something resembling a meal out of the meager supplies they had left. Each task felt like climbing a mountain, but she pushed through the exhaustion, driven by love for her children. Samuel often helped as much as he could, though he was still so young. He carried smaller pieces of wood back to the cabin and tried to entertain Mary when she grew restless. Sometimes, he would ask questions about his father, his innocent face clouded with confusion. "Why did Papa have to go?" he'd ask, his voice trembling. Elizabeth struggled to answer him, choking back tears as she explained that Papa was in heaven now watching over them. It was a lie she told herself as much as him, a way to cope with the unbearable loss. Mary, being only 4, didn't fully understand what had happened. She missed her father terribly but expressed it differently, through tantrums and tears. On especially bad days, she would cling to Elizabeth, sobbing uncontrollably until sheer fatigue lulled her to sleep. Watching her daughter suffer tore at Elizabeth's heart, but she knew she had to stay strong. If she broke down, what would happen to her children? The thought terrified her more than anything else. As the weeks dragged on, the situation grew, increasingly dire. Food became scarcer, and the temperature continued to drop. One particularly brutal night, Elizabeth lay awake long after Samuel and Mary had fallen asleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the poorly sealed windows of the cabin. She pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders, shivering despite her best efforts to stay warm. Her stomach ached with hunger, a dull, persistent pain that never went away. She thought about John, wondering if he could see her now. Did he know how hard she was fighting? Would he be proud of her? Suddenly, a noise outside jolted her from her thoughts. At first, she thought it might be an animal, a raccoon or perhaps a fox rummaging through the scraps near the cabin. But then she heard it again. Footsteps crunching softly on the frozen ground. Her pulse quickened and she sat up, straining to listen. Who or what was out there? Fear gripped her as she considered the possibilities. Was it a wild animal, drawn by the smell of human habitation? Or worse, was it someone from John's family, coming to drive them out for good? Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, Elizabeth grabbed the lantern and lit it, casting a diao, flickering glow across the room. She moved cautiously toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. With a deep breath, she opened it just a crack, peering out into the darkness. To her relief, she saw nothing unusual, just the empty expanse of snow-covered land stretching out before her. Still, the sense of unease lingered, refusing to dissipate. Something felt off. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly alone. Closing the door firmly, Elizabeth returned to her makeshift bed, pulling the blanket tightly around her once more. Sleep eluded her, however, as her mind raced with worries. What if John's family decided to return tomorrow, demanding she leave immediately? Where would they go? How would they survive? These questions swirled endlessly in her head, each one more daunting than the last. Yet amidst the fear and uncertainty, a spark of defiance burned within her. No matter what happened, she vowed silently she would protect her children. She would fight for them, even if it meant facing the harshest trials imaginable. And so, as the hours ticked by and the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Elizabeth resolved to take matters into her own hands. Staying here was no longer an option. They needed to find a new place where they could live freely, without fear of persecution. Gathering her resolve, she began making plans. Tomorrow, she decided, they would set out westward, deeper into the wilderness. It was a risky move, fraught with danger and uncertainty, but staying put promised certain doom. For better or worse, their fate rested in her hands, and she intended to rise to the challenge. The next morning, Elizabeth woke before the sun had even begun to rise. The cabin was cold and silent, save for the soft breathing of her children. She moved quietly, careful not to wake them as she prepared for their journey. There wasn't much to pack, just a few scraps of food, a single blanket, and the clothes on their backs. Everything else had been taken by John's family, leaving them with almost nothing. Still, Elizabeth forced herself to focus on what they did have, each other and the unyielding will to survive. She gently shook Samuel awake first. "Samuel," she whispered, brushing his hair back from his face. "We need to go now." His eyes fluttered open, heavy with sleep, but he nodded solemnly. He had always been a good boy, understanding far more than most children his age. Once he was up, Elizabeth turned to Mary, who was curled into a tight ball under the thin blanket. "Mary, sweetheart," she said softly, smoothing the little girl's hair. "It's time to get moving." Mary stirred groggily, rubbing her eyes with tiny fists before sitting up. Elizabeth helped both children dress in the warmest clothes they owned, layering whatever they had to fend off the biting cold. Then she knelt down in front of them, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "We're going to walk today," she explained. "A long way. But we'll stick together, okay? We'll look out for each other." Samuel nodded again, his small hand reaching for hers. Mary clung to her mother's leg, her wide eyes filled with trust. With their meager belongings bundled together, they stepped outside into the pale light of dawn. The air was sharp and icy, stinging their cheeks as they began their trek westward. Elizabeth led the way, holding Samuel's hand while Mary toddled along beside her. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she pushed forward, scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter or safety. They walked for hours, stopping only briefly to rest and share a few bites of stale bread. Hunger gnawed at all of them, but none complained. Survival depended on endurance, not comfort. By midday, the landscape began to change. The open fields gave way to dense woods, their towering trees casting long shadows across the ground. The forest seemed alive, its silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of birds. Elizabeth paused for a moment, listening intently. Something about this place felt different, both ominous and strangely comforting. She couldn't explain it, but she knew they were entering unfamiliar territory, far beyond the reaches of John's family or anyone else who might seek to harm them. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the temperature dropped noticeably. The wind picked up, howling through the branches above. Elizabeth pulled Mary closer, wrapping an arm around her shoulders to shield her from the chill. Samuel trudged along bravely, though his small frame trembled with exhaustion. Elizabeth's heart ached watching them struggle, but she reminded herself why they were doing this. Freedom, and perhaps a chance at a new life, lay somewhere ahead. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Elizabeth spotted something that made her stop in her tracks. Smoke. Faint wisps of it curled upward through the trees, rising lazily into the evening air. Her pulse quickened. Could it be a campfire? A settlement? Or something else entirely? She hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. Whoever, or whatever, was out. There could mean help. Or danger. "Stay close," she murmured to the children, tightening her grip on Samuel's hand. Slowly they crept toward the source of the smoke, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. As they drew nearer, the smell of burning wood grew stronger, mingling with the earthy scent of the forest. Then, through the trees, Elizabeth caught sight of movement. Figures, people. Her breath hitched in her throat. They weren't settlers like those she'd known. These people wore buckskin clothing and carried weapons slung across their backs. Their faces were painted with intricate designs, and their posture exuded quiet confidence. Elizabeth froze, unsure of what to do next. Should she approach them? Turn back and risk getting lost in the dark? Before she could decide, one of the figures noticed her. He stepped forward, a tall man with piercing eyes and a calm demeanor. His gaze swept over Elizabeth and her children, lingering on their weary expressions. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension between them was palpable, hanging thick in the air like the smoke from the fire. Finally, the man raised a hand in a gesture of peace. He said something in a language Elizabeth didn't understand, his tone gentle yet firm. Though she couldn't grasp his words, his body language conveyed kindness. Slowly, cautiously, he approached them, holding out a piece of dried meat. Elizabeth flinched instinctively, clutching Mary protectively. But when the man stopped a few feet away, crouching slightly to appear less intimidating, she realized he meant no harm. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her rational mind told her otherwise. These people had food and warmth, things her children desperately needed. Swallowing her fear, Elizabeth took a tentative step forward, meeting the man's gaze. He smiled faintly, his expression softening further. It was then that she noticed the intricate beadwork on his clothing and the feathers adorning his hair. This was no ordinary stranger. He was a warrior, part of a tribe she'd heard whispers about in passing, the Cheyenne. Summoning every ounce of courage, Elizabeth accepted the offering of food, nodding her thanks. The man gestured for them to follow him, leading them toward the campfire. As they approached, more faces emerged from the shadows, some curious, others cautious. But none showed hostility. Elizabeth's heart raced as she took in the scene. Teepees arranged in a circle, the glow of the fire casting flickering light on the surrounding trees. Children played nearby, laughing and chasing one another, while women tended to cooking pots and men sat talking quietly. The warrior who had greeted them introduced himself using simple gestures and broken English. "Running Bear," he said, pointing to his chest. Elizabeth repeated the name haltingly, earning a nod of approval. She pointed to herself and her children, saying their names slowly. Running Bear listened intently, his expression thoughtful. Though communication was limited, the connection between them was undeniable. In that moment, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Running Bear ushered them closer to the fire, motioning for them to sit. A woman brought over a bowl of stew, handing it to Elizabeth with a warm smile. Gratitude overwhelmed her as she accepted it, sharing the meal with Samuel and Mary. The food was simple but nourishing, filling their empty stomachs and warming their chilled bodies. For the first time in weeks, they ate until they were full. As night fell, the villagers gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. Elizabeth watched in awe, marveling at the sense of community and belonging that radiated from the group. Samuel and Mary were soon drawn into the mix, giggling as children their age invited them to join in games. Elizabeth allowed herself a rare moment of relaxation, leaning back against a log as the fire crackled soothingly. Running Bear sat nearby, occasionally glancing her way with a look of quiet concern. Though she still didn't know what lay ahead, Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders. These people, strangers though they were, had welcomed her family without question. They offered not just food and shelter but also compassion and understanding, things she hadn't experienced since John's death. As she drifted off to sleep, wrapped in a borrowed blanket and surrounded by the sounds of the forest, Elizabeth dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would be okay. The days that followed Elizabeth and her children's arrival at the Cheyenne camp passed in a blur of discovery and adaptation. Each morning, the village stirred to life with a rhythm unlike anything Elizabeth had ever known. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, the crackling of fires, and the soft hum of conversations spoken in a language she couldn't yet understand. Though she felt like an outsider, the warmth and generosity of the tribe made her feel less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged. Running Bear became their guide in this new world. Every day he visited Elizabeth and the children, teaching them small but essential things about survival in the wilderness. He showed Elizabeth how to identify edible plants, pointing out berries and roots that grew abundantly in the forest. "Good," he would say, nodding as she repeated the names of the plants after him. His patience was endless, and his gentle demeanor put her at ease. She began to trust him completely, seeing not just a warrior, but a friend who genuinely cared for their well-being. For Samuel and Mary, the village quickly became a place of wonder. The Cheyenne children were curious about the newcomers, eager to include them in their games. Samuel, though shy at first, soon found himself running alongside the boys as they practiced shooting arrows or racing through the trees. Mary, with her bright smile and infectious giggles, charmed everyone she met. The women of the tribe doted on her, braiding her hair with colorful beads and letting her help stir pots over the fire. Their kindness melted away the fear and uncertainty that had shadowed the children since John's death. Elizabeth marveled at how seamlessly her children adapted to their new surroundings. For the first time in months, they seemed truly happy. Samuel's cheeks regained some color, and Mary's laughter rang out freely, filling the air with joy. Watching them play and thrive gave Elizabeth a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. Yet, even as she embraced this newfound hope, she couldn't ignore the challenges ahead. Survival depended on learning quickly, and every moment counted. One afternoon, Running Bear took Elizabeth deeper into the forest to teach her how to hunt. It was a skill she knew little about, but one that could mean the difference between life and death during the harsh winter months. Armed with a bow and arrow, he demonstrated how to track animals, reading signs in the dirt and listening for subtle movements in the underbrush. Elizabeth watched closely, absorbing every detail. When it was her turn to try, her hands trembled as she knocked the arrow and aimed at a distant target. Her first attempt missed entirely, embedding itself harmlessly in a tree trunk. But Running Bear didn't laugh or scold her. Instead, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and encouraged her to try again. By the end of the lesson, Elizabeth managed to hit the edge of the target, a small victory, but one that filled her with pride. As they walked back to the village together, Running Bear shared pieces of his own story through gestures and broken English. He spoke of battles fought and lives lost, of protecting his people from those who sought to take their land. His words painted a picture of resilience and courage, qualities Elizabeth admired deeply. She realized then that Running Bear wasn't just teaching her how to survive. He was showing her what it meant to face adversity with strength and dignity. Back at the camp, Elizabeth threw herself into learning the ways of the Cheyenne. The women taught her how to tan hides, weave baskets, and prepare meals using ingredients she'd never seen before. At first, her efforts were clumsy and she often made mistakes, but the women laughed kindly, guiding her hands until she got it right. Slowly, she began to master these tasks, finding satisfaction in creating something useful with her own two hands. The work was hard, but it gave her purpose and a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. As weeks turned into months, Elizabeth noticed changes within herself. The constant fear and anxiety that had weighed her down began to lift, replaced by a quiet confidence. She no longer felt like the helpless widow abandoned by her in-laws. Instead, she saw herself as a survivor, someone capable of overcoming even the toughest challenges. The Cheyenne had given her more than food and shelter. They had restored her faith in humanity. But life in the wilderness wasn't without its dangers. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a low rumble echoed through the trees. The ground shook slightly, startling everyone in the camp. Running Bear appeared moments later, his expression grave. He gestured urgently toward the forest, speaking rapidly in his native tongue. Though Elizabeth didn't understand the exact words, the urgency in his voice was clear. Something was coming. The villagers sprang into action, gathering weapons and preparing for whatever threat loomed beyond the trees. Women ushered the children into the safety of the teepees while the men formed a protective circle around the perimeter. Elizabeth clutched Samuel and Mary close, her heart pounding wildly. What if it was settlers? Or worse, soldiers sent to drive the Cheyenne from their land? Fear gripped her as memories of John's cruel family flooded back. Would they be safe here? Or had they only traded one danger for another? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the tension mounted. Then finally, the source of the disturbance revealed itself. A herd of bison thundering through the forest, their massive bodies shaking the earth beneath them. Relief washed over the villagers as they realized the animals posed no direct threat. Still, Running Bear remained vigilant, ensuring everyone stayed safe until the herd moved on. Once the danger passed, the camp returned to its usual rhythm, but the incident served as a reminder of how unpredictable life in the wild could be. That night, as Elizabeth tucked Samuel and Mary into bed, she reflected on everything that had happened since they arrived. They had come so far, literally and figuratively, from the cold, desolate cabin where they had nearly starved. Here, among the Cheyenne, they had found not just survival, but a sense of belonging. Yet, Elizabeth knew their journey wasn't over. The world outside the forest was changing, and the peace they now enjoyed might not last forever. Still, she refused to dwell on the uncertainties of the future. Instead, she focused on the present, the warmth of the fire, the sound of her children's steady breathing, and the knowledge that they were safe for now. As she drifted off to sleep, wrapped in a blanket gifted by the tribe, Elizabeth allowed herself a rare moment of contentment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they would face them together. Not just her and her children, but also the people who had welcomed them with open arms. And in that moment, surrounded by kindness and community, Elizabeth found a glimmer of hope that had been missing for far too long. Winter arrived with a vengeance, blanketing the forest in a thick layer of snow that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The once vibrant landscape transformed into a silent, frozen expanse. For Elizabeth and her children, this season brought new challenges but also new lessons. Life among the Cheyenne had taught them resilience, but winter tested their strength in ways they hadn't anticipated. The tribe prepared for the cold months long before the first flakes fell. Running Bear explained to Elizabeth how important it was to gather food and supplies while the weather allowed. Together they worked tirelessly alongside the villagers, drying meat, storing roots, and sewing extra layers of fur into their clothing. Every task felt monumental, yet Elizabeth embraced each one with determination. She knew that survival depended on preparation, and she refused to let her family, or the people who had taken them in, down. Despite their efforts, the biting cold seeped into everything. Even inside the teepees, where fires burned constantly, the chill lingered in corners and crept under blankets. Elizabeth worried most about Mary, whose small body struggled to stay warm, no matter how many furs they wrapped around her. One particularly brutal night. When the wind howled like a living thing outside, Elizabeth held her daughter close, willing her own warmth to keep the little girl safe. Samuel huddled beside them, his teeth chattering softly as he drifted off to sleep. It was nights like these that reminded Elizabeth just how fragile life could be. Running Bear checked on them often during those harsh days. He brought them additional furs and showed Elizabeth how to build a fire that burned hotter and longer. His presence was a constant source of comfort, not just because of his practical help, but because of the quiet reassurance he offered. "Strong," he would say, pointing to her chest, mimicking the steady beat of her heart. Elizabeth understood what he meant. She was strong, stronger than she ever thought possible. And with each passing day, she believed him more. As winter wore on, the bond between Elizabeth's family and the tribe deepened. The women included her in storytelling sessions, sharing tales of bravery, love, and loss. Through gestures and expressions, Elizabeth pieced together the meanings of these stories, marveling at the richness of Cheyenne culture. She learned about their beliefs, the sacredness of nature, the importance of balance, and the connection between all living things. These lessons resonated deeply with her, filling gaps in her soul left by years of hardship and loneliness. Samuel thrived under the guidance of the men, especially Running Bear. Each morning, he joined the older boys in practicing archery and tracking skills. Though he was still young, his natural curiosity made him a quick learner. Running Bear praised his progress, teaching him not just how to hunt but how to respect the animals they relied on for survival. "Life gives life," he told Samuel, placing a hand over his heart and then gesturing toward the forest. It was a lesson Samuel took to heart, one that shaped the way he saw the world. Mary, too, found her place within the tribe. The women adored her, treating her like a cherished niece or granddaughter. They dressed her in beautifully crafted clothes adorned with beads and feathers, making her feel special despite the hardships around them. Her laughter became a beacon of light in the darkest days, lifting spirits and reminding everyone of the joy that remained even in difficult times. But winter wasn't without its dangers. Food supplies dwindled faster than anyone expected, forcing the tribe to ration carefully. Hunting trips grew longer and more perilous as animals sought refuge in warmer areas. On one such trip, Running Bear and several other warriors ventured far from the camp, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Elizabeth tried to distract herself with chores, but worry gnawed at her constantly. What if something happened to them? How would the tribe survive without their hunters? Days passed with no sign of their return. The tension in the camp grew palpable, especially among the women and children who waited anxiously for news. Finally, on the 5th day, shouts erupted from the edge of the forest. Elizabeth rushed outside, her heart racing as she scanned the horizon. There they were, Running Bear and the others, trudging through the snow with heavy loads of meat slung over their shoulders. Relief washed over the entire village, followed by cheers of gratitude. That night the tribe celebrated with a feast, sharing the bounty and giving thanks for the hunter's safe return. Elizabeth sat by the fire watching, as Running Bear carved a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. When he finished, he handed it to Mary, who squealed with delight. "For you," he said simply, his eyes crinkling with a smile. Mary hugged the toy tightly, refusing to let go even as she drifted off to sleep. Moments like these filled Elizabeth with gratitude, not just for the physical gifts but for the kindness and generosity that surrounded them. Yet, beneath the surface of this newfound peace, trouble brewed. Rumors began to spread of settlers encroaching on Cheyenne lands. Whispers reached the camp of wagons rolling westward, cutting down trees and claiming territory that had belonged to the tribe for generations. Running Bear spoke of these developments, with a mixture of anger and sorrow. He warned Elizabeth that tensions were rising and conflict might be inevitable. "Not safe," he said, shaking his head gravely. "I must leave." The idea of leaving terrified Elizabeth. Where would they go? How could they possibly find another sanctuary like this one? But Running Bear insisted it was the only way to protect her family. "Go back," he urged, pointing. "Eastward. Find your people." Elizabeth shook her head firmly. She couldn't abandon the Cheyenne, not after everything they had done for her. If trouble came, she vowed to stand by their side, even if it meant risking her own safety. Determined to make a difference, Elizabeth decided to act as a bridge between the settlers and the tribe. She remembered John's family and their cruel dismissal of her, but she also knew there were good people among the settlers, people who might listen if given the chance. With Running Bear's reluctant blessing, she set out one morning, accompanied by 2 warriors, to confront the growing threat. The journey to the settlers' camp was grueling, the snow making every step a struggle. When they finally arrived, Elizabeth recognized familiar faces, including Thomas, an elderly man who had known John well. His expression softened when he saw her, and he invited her inside to speak. Over cups of hot tea, Elizabeth pleaded her case, explaining the plight of the Cheyenne and urging the settlers to share the land peacefully. At first, her words fell on deaf ears, met with skepticism and hostility. But slowly, some began to listen. Thomas emerged as an unexpected ally. Moved by Elizabeth's courage and conviction, he rallied a small group of settlers willing to negotiate. Together they crafted a fragile agreement. Boundaries would be respected, resources shared, and violence avoided. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. When Elizabeth returned to the Cheyenne camp, she carried both relief and uncertainty. The agreement was tenuous, dependent on the goodwill of people who didn't always understand or trust one another. Yet, as she stood before Running Bear and the rest of the tribe, she felt a surge of pride. She had done what she could to protect her adopted family, and for now, that was enough. Winter loosened its grip gradually, melting away to reveal the promise of spring. As the snow receded and green shoots pushed through the earth, Elizabeth allowed herself to dream of brighter days ahead. They had survived the worst of the season and the worst of human cruelty. Whatever lay ahead, she knew they would face it together, united by bonds stronger than fear or hatred. And in that unity, Elizabeth found a strength she never knew she possessed. Spring arrived slowly, like a hesitant guest unsure of its welcome. The snow melted into rivulets that carved paths through the forest floor, and the air grew softer, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming flowers. For Elizabeth and her children, this change in seasons brought not just relief from the biting cold, but also a renewed sense of purpose. Life among the Cheyenne had taught them resilience, but now they faced new challenges as tensions between the settlers and the tribe continued to simmer. Elizabeth's efforts to broker peace hadn't solved everything. While some settlers respected the agreement she helped create, others remained suspicious and hostile. Whispers of conflict still lingered, spreading unease throughout both communities. Running Bear warned her repeatedly that the fragile truce might not hold for long. "They fear what they do not understand," he said one evening, his voice heavy with concern. Elizabeth nodded silently, knowing he was right. Fear had driven John's family to abandon her, and it seemed to be driving these settlers too. But she refused to give up hope. If anything, her determination only grew stronger. Each day, Elizabeth worked tirelessly to strengthen the bond between the two groups. She visited the settler camps regularly, speaking to anyone who would listen. Her words were simple yet heartfelt. "We all want the same things: to live, to provide for our families, to find peace. At first, many dismissed her, unwilling to see beyond their own fears. But over time, her persistence began to pay off. A few settlers started coming to the Cheyenne camp, curious about their way of life. They watched as the tribe hunted, fished, and gathered food, marveling at their deep connection to the land. Slowly, barriers began to break down. Running Bear played a crucial role in this process. He welcomed the settlers with open arms, showing them how the Cheyenne lived in harmony with nature. He explained their traditions, shared stories of their ancestors, and demonstrated their respect for the earth. One day, he even invited a group of settlers to join in a ceremonial dance. Elizabeth watched as they hesitated at first, unsure of what was expected of him. But when the drums began to beat and the dancers moved in rhythmic unison, something shifted. The settlers relaxed, clapping along or tapping their feet to the music. It was a small moment, but it carried great significance, a step toward understanding and acceptance. For Samuel and Mary, spring brought opportunities to explore and grow. Samuel spent more time with the Cheyenne boys, learning skills that would serve him well in the future. He practiced tracking animals, setting snares, and building shelters. Each success filled him with pride, and he often came running back to Elizabeth to share his accomplishments. Mary, meanwhile, blossomed under the care of the women in the tribe. She learned how to weave baskets, grind corn, and prepare meals. Her laughter echoed through the camp, a reminder of the joy that could exist even in uncertain times. But despite these moments of progress, trouble loomed on the horizon. News reached the village of soldiers marching westward, sent by the government to claim lands for expansion. These men cared little for agreements or treaties. Their mission was clear: push the Cheyenne further into the wilderness or force them onto reservations. When Running Bear shared this information with Elizabeth, her heart sank. All her hard work, all the bridges she had tried to build, seemed destined to crumble under the weight of greed and ignorance. Determined not to let fear dictate their fate, Elizabeth devised a plan. She convinced Running Bear to send messengers to nearby tribes, urging them to unite against the threat. "Alone, we are weak," she told him. "Together, we are strong." Though skeptical at first, Running Bear saw the wisdom in her words. The Cheyenne reached out to the Lakota, the Arapaho, and other neighboring tribes, forming an alliance based on mutual protection and survival. It was a risky move, one that required trust and cooperation among groups who had sometimes been rivals. But necessity forged bonds where none existed before. As the days passed, Elizabeth focused on preparing the village for whatever lay ahead. She helped store extra food, repair weapons, and fortify the camp. The women worked together to sew sturdy clothing and craft tools that could withstand the rigors of travel if evacuation became necessary. Every task felt urgent. Every decision weighed heavily on her mind. Yet amidst the chaos, Elizabeth found solace in the unity of the tribe. No matter what happened, they would face it together. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near the edge of the forest, Elizabeth encountered Thomas, the elderly settler who had supported her during negotiations. His face was lined with worry and his hands trembled slightly as he approached her. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The soldiers are closer than we thought. They mean to strike soon." His warning sent a chill down her spine, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Thank you for telling me," she replied, her tone steady. "We'll be ready." That night, Elizabeth called a meeting with Running Bear and the other leaders of the alliance. Together, they discussed strategies for defense and evacuation. Some argued for standing their ground, while others believed retreating deeper into the wilderness was the only option. The debate grew heated, emotions running high as everyone grappled with the gravity of the situation. Finally, Running Bear stood, his presence commanding silence. "We fight, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us," he declared. "If we run, we lose everything. If we stand, we have a chance." Inspired by his words, the group agreed to prepare for battle while also making plans for the safety of the women and children. Elizabeth volunteered to lead the evacuation efforts, ensuring that those unable to fight would have a safe place to retreat. It was a daunting responsibility, but she knew it was vital. As she organized supplies and coordinated routes, she couldn't help but think of John. What would he say if he could see her now? Would he be proud of the woman she had become? The morning of the soldiers' arrival dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that mirrored the mood of the camp. Elizabeth hugged Samuel and Mary tightly, tears pricking her eyes as she whispered instructions. Stay close to the others. Do exactly as they tell you. I'll find you when it's over. Mary clung to her, sobbing softly, while Samuel nodded, bravely, though his lower lip quivered. Letting go of them felt like tearing a piece of her soul away, but she knew it was the only way to keep them safe. As the children joined the evacuation group, Elizabeth turned to Running Bear. "Be careful," she said, her voice breaking slightly. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze unwavering. "You too," he replied. Then, without another word, they parted ways, each heading toward their respective roles in the coming storm. The battle that followed was chaotic and fierce. Gunfire echoed through the trees, mingling with the cries of warriors and the clash of metal against wood. Elizabeth stayed behind the front lines, tending to the wounded and offering whatever support she could. Her hands trembled as she bandaged cuts and stopped bleeding, but she forced herself to focus. Every life saved was a victory, no matter how small. Hours later, as the fighting subsided, Elizabeth emerged from the makeshift medical tent to survey the aftermath. The scene was devastating. Bodies littered the ground, smoke curled from burned-out structures, and the air hung thick with the smell of gunpowder. But amidst the destruction there was also resilience. The Alliance had held firm, driving the soldiers back and securing a temporary reprieve. Exhausted but alive, Elizabeth searched frantically for Samuel and Mary, her heart pounding with dread. When she finally found them, huddled with the other evacuees, relief washed over her like a tidal wave. That night, as the survivors gathered around dwindling fires, Elizabeth reflected on everything they had endured. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with uncertainty and danger. But they had proven something important, that unity and courage could overcome even the greatest odds. As she looked around at the faces of her adopted family, Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude. They had given her more than shelter and food. They had given her purpose, strength, and hope, and in return, she had given them everything she had. The days following the battle were somber, filled with both mourning and gratitude. The Alliance had succeeded in driving the soldiers back, but the cost was high. Lives had been lost, and the scars of conflict lingered in the hearts of those who remained. Elizabeth moved through the camp like a ghost, her body weary but her spirit unbroken. She helped tend to the wounded, bury the dead, and rebuild what had been destroyed. Each task felt monumental, yet she pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that survival depended on resilience. Running Bear bore the weight of leadership heavily. His face was etched with exhaustion, but his eyes still burned with determination. He called another meeting with the leaders of the allied tribes, this time to discuss the future. "We cannot stay here," he said, his voice firm despite the fatigue in his tone. "The soldiers will return stronger next time. We must go where they cannot follow." The idea of leaving their ancestral lands pained everyone, but no one argued. They all knew it was the only way to ensure their survival. Elizabeth listened intently as plans took shape. The tribes would scatter temporarily, retreating deeper into the wilderness until the immediate threat passed. Once safe, they would regroup and decide their next steps. Running Bear turned to Elizabeth, his expression softening slightly. "You and your children, you will come with us," he said. It wasn't a question, but an offer she couldn't refuse. Though part of her longed to return to the settler camps, to continue bridging the gap between two worlds, she knew her place was with the people who had saved her family. Preparations for the journey began immediately. The women packed supplies, wrapping dried meat, roots, and herbs in animal skins. The men repaired weapons and crafted new ones, ensuring they were ready for whatever dangers lay ahead. Samuel and Mary watched quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment. Samuel tried to help wherever he could, carrying bundles of firewood or fetching water from the stream. Mary clung to Elizabeth, her small hand gripping her mother's skirt tightly. "Where are we going?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Elizabeth smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Somewhere. Safe," she replied. "Somewhere we can start again." The morning of their departure arrived too quickly. The air was crisp, tinged with the promise of spring, but the mood among the villagers was subdued. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the camp watching as families loaded their belongings onto travois pulled by horses. Samuel held Mary's hand, his young face set with determination. Running Bear approached them, his arms laden with furs and tools. "Ready?" he asked, his gaze steady. Elizabeth nodded, though her heart ached at the thought of leaving behind the life they had built. But she reminded herself that life was not about staying in one place. It was about moving forward, no matter how hard the road. The journey westward was grueling. Each day brought new challenges: treacherous terrain, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of wild animals. Yet there were also moments of beauty. The sun rising over snow-capped peaks, the sound of a rushing river cutting through the forest, the sight of deer grazing in quiet meadows. These glimpses of nature's splendor gave Elizabeth strength, reminding her of the world's vastness and its capacity for wonder. As they traveled, Elizabeth noticed subtle changes within herself. The fear and uncertainty that had once consumed her began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence. She no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstance, but as someone capable of shaping her own destiny. The Cheyenne had taught her how to survive, but more importantly, they had taught her how to thrive. She carried their lessons with her, not just in the skills she had learned, but in the values they had instilled: courage, compassion, and respect for the land. One evening, as the group made camp near a crystal-clear lake, Running Bear sought Elizabeth out. He sat beside her, his presence comforting as always. For a long while, neither of them spoke, content to watch the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Finally, he broke the silence. "You have done much for us," he said, his voice low. "More than you know." Elizabeth shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No," she replied. "You saved us. Without you, my children and I wouldn't be here." Running Bear smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Perhaps," he said, "but you have given us hope. That is worth more than anything." His words stayed with Elizabeth long after the conversation ended. Hope. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered by hardship and loss. Yet it was also powerful, capable of sustaining people through the darkest times. As she looked around at the faces of her adopted family, the laughter of the children, the quiet strength of the warriors, the unwavering support of the women, she realized that hope was what bound them together. It was the thread that wove their lives into a tapestry of resilience and unity. Weeks turned into months as the group continued their journey. They found temporary refuge in hidden valleys and secluded forests, places untouched by settlers and soldiers. Life was simpler, here stripped down to its essentials. They hunted, fished, and gathered food, living in harmony with the land. Elizabeth marveled at how quickly her children adapted, their laughter ringing out as they played among the trees. Samuel grew taller and stronger, his skills as a tracker improving with each passing day. Mary blossomed under the care of the women, her curiosity leading her to explore every corner of their new surroundings. Yet even in this sanctuary, Elizabeth knew they couldn't stay forever. The outside world still loomed large, its influence impossible to escape entirely. Rumors of further encroachments reached them occasionally, carried by scouts or travelers passing through. Each report reinforced the need for caution, reminding them that peace was fleeting and fragile. Still, Elizabeth refused to let fear dictate their lives. Instead, she focused on building connections, not just within the tribe but with other groups they encountered along the way. Through her efforts, alliances began to form, small bands of settlers, disillusioned by the greed and violence of their own kind, sought refuge among the tribes. Elizabeth welcomed them, teaching them the ways of the Cheyenne and encouraging mutual understanding. It wasn't easy. Mistrust ran deep on both sides. But slowly, barriers began to break down. Shared meals, stories, and experiences created bonds that transcended differences, proving that coexistence was possible if people were willing to try. Years passed, and the landscape changed as much as the people within it. Samuel grew into a young man, strong and wise beyond his years. He became a bridge between the tribes and the settlers, using his knowledge of both worlds to foster cooperation. Mary, now a teenager, carried the spirit of her childhood into adulthood, her kindness and optimism inspiring those around her. And Elizabeth? She remained a pillar of strength, her love for her children and her adopted family unwavering. 1. Summer evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Elizabeth stood atop a hill overlooking the valley where they had settled. The scene before her was one of peace and prosperity, a testament to the resilience of those who had fought so hard to create it. Behind her, Samuel and Mary joined her, their presence a reminder of everything she had worked for. "It's beautiful," Mary whispered, her voice filled with awe. Elizabeth nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "Yes," she said softly, "it is." In that moment, surrounded by the people she loved and the land she had come to cherish, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Her journey had been long and difficult, marked by loss and struggle. But it had also been rich with love, growth, and hope. She had started as a widow abandoned by cruel in-laws, desperate to protect her children. Now she was a leader, a mediator, and a symbol of unity. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold challenges, but she faced them with courage and faith. For Elizabeth, the story of her life was no longer defined by tragedy. It was defined by triumph.